Good evening. Good evening, and welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum at the Institute of Politics. My name is Jackson Deutsch. I'm a first year at the college planning on studying social studies. I'm also a member of the John F. Kennedy Jr. Committee here. Before we begin, please note the exit doors, which are located on both the Park side and the JFK Street side of the forum. In the event of an emergency, please walk to the exit closest to you and congregate in the JFK Park. Please also take a moment now to silence your cell phones. And join me in welcoming the Dean of the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, Jeremy Weinstein.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum at the Institute of Politics. I'm Jeremy Weinstein, the new Dean of the Kennedy School. We're going to be joined tonight on stage by two superb governors. They're terrific chiefs of staff and an exceptional member of our faculty for a conversation on disagreeing better in state government. I wanted to say a few things at the outset before I invite them up to the stage. At the Kennedy School, we strive to equip our students with the tools they need to succeed as public leaders. And maybe the single most important skill in that toolkit, arguably the Swiss Army knife of that toolkit, is the ability to disagree, and to disagree respectfully and constructively. It's essential for everything from negotiating a budget, to getting buy-in to a legislative priority, to engaging constituents with a diversity of views. Since 2022, HKS has been thinking deeply about how we can best teach our students to engage with different perspectives, to navigate well-meaning disagreements, and to forge common ground. This is a real challenge for us, and it's a challenge for anyone in higher education at this moment. We did a survey, a climate assessment, a couple years ago, and about a third of our students reported in the classroom a discomfort with expressing their true political views. If we're going to be the best training ground for future leaders in democratic societies, we must find ways of developing and practicing constructive disagreement. That's why we're working hard at HKS to foster a culture of what we call candid and constructive conversations. We're trying all sorts of things to figure out how to create the space that we need. We're building workshops on constructive and productive disagreement into our orientation. We're innovating new online modules and an AI-assisted tutor that helps people figure out how to have conversations across difference. We've adopted a school-wide non-attribution rule to give our students the safe space in the classroom to show up as their authentic selves. We're working with our faculty in faculty meetings on strategies to support free and open inquiry. We're running clinics to help students practice the skills that they need, and we're hosting events just like this one, in which people with diverse perspectives come together to discuss how they approach solving problems. Now, of course, beyond our campus, polarization is now a persistent feature of our national politics. As evidenced by the very election that is a few weeks away, people feel quite strongly and quite differently about politics. And we've seen a movement to the extreme. The share of Republicans who identify as moderates on economic issues has dropped by 17 points over the last 2 decades. In the same period, the share of Democrats who identify as moderates on social issues has dropped by 16 points. The middle is disappearing. And these differences have consequences for our democratic institutions. The 118th Congress, which is just finishing up, is among the least productive Congress in decades, passing just 27 bills in this last year. And that includes a few measures to name federal buildings, and very little on issues of consequence, like healthcare, education, or technology. Now, in this sea of gloomy headlines about Washington, our state leaders are stepping up. Effective governors have to be the adults in the room, able and willing to work across the aisle. When a hurricane strikes their state or highway needs fixing, there's no time to put on a team red or team blue jersey. Both former Governor Hutchinson and Governor Mills have built strong reputations as pragmatic and effective leaders who rise above the partisan fray. While serving as governor of Arkansas, Mr. Hutchinson and his chief of staff, Alison Williams, who's also with us, encouraged students to pursue technology careers by making computer science a graduation requirement. Because of their efforts, 770% more students in Arkansas enrolled in computer science classes between 2015 and 2021. Governor Hutchinson scaled this success nationally while chairing the NGA from 2021 to 2022, persuading all 50 governors to sign onto his compact to advance K-12 computer science education, which outlined a national strategy for expanding tech offerings across America's public schools. That counts, that matters. In Maine, Governor Janet Mills and her chief of staff, Jeremy Kennedy, who's also with us, have forwarded several bipartisan budgets, helping Mainers recover economically from the pandemic, making historic investments in housing, and fully funding Maine's public schools for the first time in history. She's made an impact by steering clear of national partisan warfare. The theme of her 2020 statewide address was, "We are not Washington, we're Maine." I look forward to hearing our panelists' insights tonight. Governors Hutchinson and Mills have been committed partners to HKS, engaging our students through the Taubman Center's Transition Term program and its Economic Development Seminar. And I also want to welcome to the room tonight the advisory board for our Taubman Center, who make all of the programs that I listed possible. Tonight, our conversation will be guided by an extraordinary scholar and a great friend who's been a champion of state and local governments, Jeff Liebman, the Robert Scrivner Professor of Public Policy, and the director of the Taubman Center for State and Local Government. Please join me in welcoming all of our speakers to the stage.
Thank you, Dean Weinstein, both for those kind words and for your commitment to improving the quality of discourse at our school and in the country. I'm so pleased to be here with our illustrious guests who, in addition to having reached the pinnacle of government leadership, as in governors, have really had a lifetime of commitment to public service. And I'm not going to do their full biographies because we have 4 people and about an hour to talk. But it's they're very inspirational people to be around. So I'm very excited about this topic. I don't think I've ever seen a forum where we put governors and their chiefs of staff on stage at the same time, and so
Family Feud.
So I'm gonna jump right in here and see if we can pull back the curtain a little bit about what it's like to be a governor and a chief of staff when they disagree with each other and have to have constructive conversations. And so maybe we'll hear from each of the governors first. But sometimes there can be a temptation to surround yourself with people who are loyal and going to say yes to whatever you're thinking. But Governor Mills, how do you approach creating a culture where your chief of staff and others on your team can disagree with you when they want to and tell you what they're really thinking?
Well, I got some good advice from Senator Angus King when I first took office almost 6 years ago, who had been governor of Maine for 8 years, sometime before. And he said, look, your success actually depends on the success and who you pick and how you pick your staff, your cabinet, and your sub-cabinet members, because they're going to tell the world what you're about, and they're going to implement your strategies, your plans, and help design them. And so, and he also said, don't pick people because of party loyalty or partisan politics. Just pick the best people you can find. Now, Jeremy was my campaign manager, so politics was not a non-issue in picking my chief of staff, and we were very close because he was my campaign manager. And we worked, if you're on a statewide campaign, things get pretty hot and heavy, and you need somebody you can personally and professionally rely on. And that was our relationship, of course. But when it came to picking cabinet members and other staff, I ended up having a cabinet of 15 people with whom he deals directly every day. 2/3 of them are women, as it turns out. None of them were on my campaign. None of them, as far as I know, campaigned for me 6 years ago. But Angus also said, look, pick people who will disagree with you. Make sure you know that they have a different point of view and they need to express it. He said, look, all of us are more successful than one of us alone. And if you're on my staff, and you and I both agree on everything, then maybe one of us isn't necessary, right? But you want to create an atmosphere. And he used to tell every new staff person, tell me when I'm full of shit, quote unquote. I haven't done that, but I think well, sometimes I've said that individually. But I think we've had an open door policy, and I had that policy when I was Attorney General as well for 8 years, and so I think the people around me grew to know that the door was always open. Drop in and tell me what's going on, and if I'm shocked by something, tell me why I didn't know about it, and tell me good news, bad news, or I don't know news, because I need to know. Not everything, but as much as possible. And that's been my policy, and I think we've carried that out pretty robustly.
Governor, I'm going to follow up, because if you don't do this first, your chief of staff probably will. But is there a story about a time when your chief disagreed with you and you changed your mind, or someone else on your team did?
We had a year ago tomorrow, we had the worst tragedy the state of Maine has ever experienced. 18 people were shot and killed in 2 different venues by one crazy gunman. We had never had something like that happen in Maine. So the natural response automatically by some members of the public was, Mills needs to do something. We got to do something about guns. And so when the legislature came back into session in January, and we started talking long before that about gun measures, and there were some obvious issues that were sort of broadly known. Universal background checks, which had been rejected by many people in a referendum. 13 out of 16 counties had voted it down. 72-hour waiting periods. Red flag laws. Whereas we had worked very hard in 2019 to develop what the press have called a yellow flag law, which has been very successful, actually, and which was not used before the shooting a year ago, which could have been used before that shooting, which could have prevented the shooting. And so I could have just sort of dug in and said, the law we devised and negotiated and drafted and got through the Senate with a unanimous vote and a House vote of 136-9, I think. That law is successful. It's on the books. We should just keep using it. But no, there was a lot of pressure, political and otherwise. And within my office, and Jeremy among them, were saying, you've got to do something more. You've got to satisfy the people who want something more on the books. And we had a lot of discussions about how to tailor some other law, or how to refine the laws on the books in a way that would satisfy Maine people, that would respect our historic, our outdoor recreation legacy, our historic traditions of hunting and trapping and whatnot. And we ultimately did that, but not without a lot of negotiating. I'm from the 2nd District of Maine, which has a much stronger history of outdoor sports than the 1st District does. The people from southern Maine were arguing very strenuously in favor of universal background checks and red flag law and whatnot, and I resisted it. And we came to a compromise ultimately within the office and then within the legislature for a tweaking of our existing law so that background checks would be required for anybody who sold guns commercially, anybody who advertised for the sale of guns, but not private sales. And at the same time, we would increase the penalty for private sale or any sale where you sold to somebody who's a prohibited person, a felon or person under a domestic violence order, whom you should have known, who you recklessly disregarded the fact that he or she was a prohibited person. We increased that penalty to a felony so as to encourage private sellers to do background checks, but not mandate it. And so, and there were some tweaks in the legislature, but that essentially is what got through. Plus, we created a mental health, violent crime section in the Maine CDC to continue to create data, study where violent crime exists and what we can do about it. So all those, and mental health, big issue. So we beefed up the law on the books, which does require a mental health assessment before you can take somebody's guns, and a police officer involvement before you can take somebody's guns. We beefed that up, creating more maintaining the due process measures in the law, but increasing background checks and the like. So we did it, but that was not the popular thing in my office, not initially. And we did it by looking at a lot of other states as well and seeing what they were doing. And I mean, we had similar discussions, he and I and the rest of the staff, about abortion measures and some other controversial bills. But that one stands out most recently.
Thank you, Governor. Governor Hutchinson, the same question for you. How do you think about creating an environment in your office where people are willing to disagree with you? And then, even better, tell us the story about a time when there was a real disagreement.
Well, first of all, it's very good to be with you, and it's an honor to be with Governor Mills. The National Governor Association, I think, sometimes is the last bastion of bipartisanship. And so we work together on issues through that association, and it's good to be with her. And it's good to be with my former Chief of Staff, Alison Williams. And, you know, I think about, you know, how you create the openness in an office in order to have disagreements. And whenever you look at Alison Williams, I'm going to say this, she can deny it if she wants to, but I would describe her as center left, and I'm center right. Now,
I will deny it. I have taken the Pew, whatever the Pew
all right,
thing
so
is.
All right.
I'm a libertarian.
Okay, so it was a given that we disagreed on certain issues from the very, very beginning. And so the disagreements are always under the surface. And so Alison, as my Chief of Staff, did an incredible job of, one, creating an environment in the office of openness. And so we made sure that we could talk to each other. And I created this. Whenever we would have a meeting, it's not just the department heads, but it's others. And they knew that I would be asking down to the intern level, what do you think about this issue? And so you create that environment of openness and the ability to disagree. And then you have to be intentional about bringing people in the office that you know have a diverse background. In our rule, we have a very conservative Republican legislature, and they expected me to hire everyone who is an arch conservative. That's sort of the expectation. Well, I wanted to make sure I had people on my staff that the Black Legislative Caucus felt comfortable coming to, that I could have my legislative director that everybody could feel comfortable in coming to, and I had to make sure I had some arch conservatives on my staff that the arch conservatives, the legislature felt comfortable coming to. But it was that environment that was created. So I think you have to be very intentional about it. And we had a lot of hot button issues in Arkansas that came up during the 8 years as governor. And there was disagreement, but always, even though we had a diverse opinion, whenever I made the decision, this is where the direction we're going, everybody supported it. And so it was never a climate of ugly disagreement. There was never a leak over 8 years as governor for the discussions in our office. So it was a good time, and I give credit to our Chief of Staff for doing that. The libertarian, I guess now is what she is.
We learn something about each other every day.
And then I got to tell a story too, because this reflects how people who disagree can find some common ground. We had, just like across the country, the George Floyd protest. And it happened in Little Rock, Arkansas, and I watched violence happen in our streets. The Capitol was threatened. I called out the state police, the National Guard, and I said, we've got to make sure we maintain order. That night, 70 people were arrested, and the violence totally stopped. But the second thing I did, I brought in the African American protest leaders into my office, and I said, what do you all are interested in? And they outlined some different things. And I said, you can protest, but if you would like to accomplish some things, would you be willing to serve on a task force in which you would look at police reform and police training, the issues that you talk about. And they jumped out of their seat and they said, of course we would. And I said, there's one condition. On that task force, you're going to have chiefs of police and county sheriffs and law enforcement people. They did it. They worked together, and the other side was just as surprised when I put them all together. But after about 3 months, they came forward with recommendations that were what the protesters wanted, but also increased pay for law enforcement, and the legislature adopted the recommendations. And so to me, that's governing in the office, but people, even though they disagree, can listen to each other in that environment and make progress.
Thank you, Governor. Chief Williams, there must have been situations where you felt like you were getting more information from the ground level than the governor was, because the governor's busy and dealing with everything, and maybe even something where you thought he was on the way to making the wrong decision. In those kind of circumstances, how did you deal with that?
This is where he and I go into a booth, a soundproof booth, and you guys can talk.
Well, I would never say that the governor was more poorly informed than I was, ever. What I would say is that we had complementary networks. And so it became almost a game, honestly, for me to like go find the one piece of information or the one person he hadn't talked to yet and come back and be like, guess what I have? I've got more information for you. And so this did two things. One, it certainly made me more willing to go out and talk to more people rather than just staying in the office and talking to our staff who were, as the governor mentioned, represented lots of different perspectives, but we needed to talk to stakeholders outside of the office. And so I made a point to do that. It made those stakeholders feel like they had input into the process, which is important. And like I said, sometimes I would come back with a piece of data that he did not already have, and I felt really good about that. And he was always very gracious. One time, he did not know that we were disagreeing.
Just like today.
But a short story. So we had a disagreement about how much time people needed to be in their seats or at their desks in the Capitol. What did it mean to come to work? And we had this young staffer who came in to me one day and said, I've met someone, she lives in Washington, D.C. Now, we had a Washington office, as many governors do. Can I, on my own dime, drive out to Washington and spend 2 weeks a month working from Washington and do all my work from there?
No.
And I said, for the sake of love, I think we can make this work.
Ooh.
And he did this for at least 3 months. And the governor was never the wiser.
Exactly.
Until my entire plan fell apart because he sat next to that young woman's boss at dinner who said, so your criminal justice attorney is dating my chief of staff. And the governor said, what do you mean? And he said, yeah, he's out here all the time. Nobody gave me the heads up that this conversation had happened. And so he comes back and he says, how long has Zach been going to Washington? And I said, oh, about 3 months now. And he was like, okay. But I really feel like I won the day because that couple is now married. They live in Little Rock and they have 2 children. So I increased the tax base. I'm going to take that.
Oh man, it's hard to top that one. But Chief Kennedy, what can you add about what it's like to? Sorry, you guys are still in
How
office.
many marriages did you facilitate, Jeremy?
I haven't facilitated a marriage yet, but we've had several office babies, but not of people in the office.
Yes.
I guess what I would add is, when we came into office, even though we had known each other on the campaign side of things and we were already friends, I had never worked in state government before, like not 1 minute before I became chief of staff. And she had a very long career in state government. And so we knew that would balance it out well. But, what we learned when we go to, they call it baby governor school for all the new governors, they get to go do their orientation with NGA, and the chiefs also get to do that. They told us that you're a gatekeeper. You're supposed to be the filter. You're supposed to keep things off your boss's desk. You're supposed to, all of that stuff. And so I even came to Harvard for something, and they made us read the book, The Gatekeepers, And so that was my whole vision. But what I soon learned about the governor is that for her entire career, she had been connected to people on the ground. She was district attorney for a long time. She was a state rep. She was attorney general. She was used to knocking on doors in her district to win for herself. Like, she was very in touch with people. And everybody in the state had her personal email, her phone number, her Facebook Messenger, and so my inclination when we won on election night was shut it down. And I had a brand new iPhone I had bought for her that I gave to her on that night and said, you're getting a new number, all of that. But what I soon learned is she was going to be a very unhappy governor if I cut her off from people. And the whole goal of gatekeeping is to make the governor more effective at their job. So if your gatekeeping is actually making them feel more isolated and alone and unhappy, then you have failed. So we had to come to a balance where I think that she has learned to understand the things that cause us grief in the digital space, or if she's emailing with people or whatever, she's learned that as governor, she has to communicate differently to those people now because they have expectations, right? And what I've learned is I've got to let her be herself. It can be really easy for a chief of staff to want to see their governor as a product. That you move around, you put the talking points in front of them, they do this, and then you need them to move over here. But their job is actually to run the state government. And she loves doing that. She's down in the weeds, she loves to get her hands dirty, which is probably very different from how other governors do it. But that's how she finds joy, I think, in her work, which leads to a better product. And so I think that when it comes to information sharing, I don't feel like there's ever a competition to have the information, but it's about timing. And I have to think, I have 50 things I could tell her. And we're both very we want to just text it, we want to just say it. But what I've realized is I might need a certain response out of her. And in order to get that response, when are you telling her this information? And based on the information, do you kick everybody else out of the room and do you shut the doors? Do you bring in other people? And you really have to do that assessment because information in and of itself can be really useless and almost misleading sometimes. So you've got to really think about, what am I trying to accomplish with this piece of information? And as an anecdote, I don't want to keep talking about our mass shooting, but it did just happen and it was very impactful. And I'm the one that got the call that this is happening. She had just finished an event, and I knew the event she had finished was a fun event where she had been enjoying herself. I think it was a dinner party or something. And I knew she was getting in the car, and I had to call her and quickly tell her what was going on. And so I just said, I need you to listen. I'm going to tell you something that I've never told you before, and this is real, and it's serious, and I just want you to hear it, And I don't know how you felt in that moment, but I
wanted to go to Lewiston. I wanted to go directly to Lewiston, and my security guys said, you can't go to Lewiston. There's a killer on the loose. And I want to go to Lewiston.
And so we all convened at the governor's mansion, to figure out what to do. And I know in that moment what I felt, because my deputy called me and he said, we need to go to the governor's mansion. I said, I don't want to go. And he said, why not? And I said, I don't know what to do. And that was one of those moments where she also got to say, I don't know what to do either. And let's figure it out.
We got through it.
Thank you for that. Governor Mills, the dean in his introduction mentioned that you have quite a record of working constructively across the aisle, of holding together what can be a fractious coalition within your party. Was there something that happened, some experience you had early in your career that taught you the skills for how to work with people who, you may not have seen eye to eye with?
Early in my career, well, my father was former U.S. attorney, like Asa, a Republican U.S. attorney under Eisenhower, Nixon, and Ford. So go figure. And was brought up in a Republican family, and then all of us children ultimately became Democrats. So our Thanksgiving dinners were like the United Nations meetings. But they were Margaret Chase Smith Republicans and Bill Cohen type Republicans. And I modeled myself to some extent on George Mitchell and other Democrats who had done us proud in the U.S. Senate. And so we came to a disagreement. You'd exchange views. I think there's nothing like retail politics to make you understand that there are a lot of other people out there with a lot of other views, and you've got to listen carefully. Margaret Chase Smith famously said, public service is not just a job, it's about making people know that you're honest, keeping your integrity, making sure you always know that constructive criticism is to be expected and sought, that smears are to be expected and fought, and that honor is to be earned and never bought. And her creed from the 1950s, from 1953, led politics in Maine for a long, long time, both sides of the aisle. I think it was in my mind all the time I was district attorney, all the time I was attorney general, and since the time I've been governor too. We've had disagreements with our own legislature many times. I have a same political party legislature. You do too. Some of the worst disagreements are with your own party. Keeping those disagreements honest and above board and not angry is not always an easy thing. I can think of many, many examples of that. But finding common ground, that's a book that Olympia Snow wrote, right? Finding common ground is important. And that's when I train people in my party to campaign and to do doors, I tell them, don't go knocking on a door and say you're going to give them your views on guns, abortion, education, what else. You're there to hear from them and to see what's on their minds and to find common ground, whether it's having kids in the same school, having gone to school with them or your cousin with them, or whatever, and having an interest in education or healthcare or public service. Find that common ground. Don't go for the hot button issues right off. Leave that in the background. That'll come sometime, but it's more important that they know you as a person. And I think I love retail politics. I love walking down Main Street, and I miss it because being in the governor's office, you don't get to do that much. Just going to every barber shop and every beauty parlor and corner store and saying, hey, I'm Janet Mills. How's it going here in Waterville, Maine? What's going on? What should I know about? That's my history.
All right, I'm going to come back in a second, Governor, to you. So you talked about your disagreements with the legislature.
Yeah,
tell me a story in a second, but I'm going to turn back to Governor Hutchinson again. Was there something early in your career that taught you how to disagree in a constructive way?
Well, of course, I was appointed as the youngest U.S. attorney in the nation by Ronald Reagan. I was the age of 31. And so Ronald Reagan, of course, is a mentor and a distant mentor. I'm down here, he's up here. But, he got elected and he had an economic plan, but he had a Democrat Congress led by Tip O'Neill, and he made a decision, let's get some things done. And so that's a model that I've always seen. And, I think Ronald Reagan reflected optimism about America. He reflected pragmatism in his leadership capability. And at the same time, he was a consistent conservative. And so that's sort of the model that I've tried to follow. When I got to Congress, I was on the Judiciary Committee where all the hot-button social issues go through, guns and abortion and everything. And John Conyers, a liberal Democrat from Michigan, was the leader of the House Judiciary on the Democrat side. And we went through some tough times, from the impeachment to all the hot issues. But one of the things that I'm proud of is that we could disagree and still be respectful of each other. And whenever I was nominated by President Bush to head up the DEA, I had to be Senate confirmed. Who walked over to the Senate and nominated me and spoke for me in the United States Senate? But John Conyers did. And those are just examples that shape your life. And so, you become governor of the state and you want to get things done. You have to be pragmatic about it. You have to work hard in doing it. But I think it starts with those fundamental principles of trying to find the common ground. The National Governors Association is probably another example of it, that we disagreed on a whole host of things. But we did reach agreement on the Infrastructure Act
Veterans.
that was passed. We endorsed that in a bipartisan way, and the CHIPS Act as well. And so I love it whenever, I know not all the Republicans supported it, but the National Governors Association that I led at the time, we did it in a bipartisan way. So that's a little bit of my background and my approach to it, and still live by it.
Remember Spencer Cox, when he was chair of the association last year? His theme was to disagree better, and I think he was here talking about that. And one of the things I remember him saying, it was a toast at the White House. He said, "Proximity matters. It's hard to hate up close."
Yeah,
I love that.
that's a good phrase.
Yeah.
All right, I'm going to come back to the chiefs for one more round, and then we'll turn it over to questions from the audience. But Chief Williams, is there a story about, I don't know, some controversy with the legislature or some other big disagreement that you had to pull everything together on that you could share with us?
Well, again, a lot of the credit goes to the governor. Excuse me. We had, he mentioned the reaction that he had and the coalition that he brought together after the George Floyd shooting, which was significant for sure. A sort of more mundane but equally important aspect of his administration was reorganizing state government. And when he came into office, he had 42 or 43 direct reports, cabinet and sub-cabinet officials that reported to him, which is just no way. I mean, you said 12 or 13, and I thought,
15.
God, that's glorious. And so we ultimately got to 15, which was great. That span of control and that ability to manage your enterprise made a real difference. And Governor Hutchinson, because he had been at the Department of Homeland Security when it was created, understood what it would take to transform state government in that way. So he, of course, had the toughest part of dealing with the legislature, and he can tell you war stories, I'm sure, about that. But it was equally difficult in dealing with those cabinet officials that were being impacted, particularly those who were not going to become the secretary of a department, or they were subsumed into a department and suddenly they were going to be obligated to report on their activities to someone. And so I think we had, it did fall a lot to me, although I know the governor did a lot of this work too, but it did fall a lot to me to manage the egos and the behavior of our cabinet officials who were unhappy. And the benefit of that, the outcome of that, was that we had very few cabinet officials attrit in the reorganization. And that benefit accrued to the taxpayers of Arkansas, both in terms of experience in the job and in better services that they could expect from their governor and their government.
Alison, can I just push you a little bit more? When you had a person who'd been essentially demoted and they were unhappy and they were in your office, what did you say?
Well, I mean, in those cases, it was like, well, if you would like to submit your resignation, we can talk about that. I think, a lot of it, though, in all honesty, is just listening. They just want to be heard. People just want to be heard. They want to feel that they have been, at least their position is respected. And there wasn't a lot of time always. I don't think many cabinet officials got nearly as much time as they expected to get with the head of state government. I think they thought they were sort of going to be operating as his staff, which is just not the case. They had their own agency to run. And so there was a lot of care and feeding of sort of an ego management and behavior management. But in the worst cases, there were folks who were just like, I'm going to quit if I don't get my way. And I would say, if you would like to see the governor to let him know, that'd be great, or I'm happy to accept your resignation now.
All right.
The governor's made his decision, and we salute smartly and go with it.
Yeah.
Thank you. Chief Kennedy, what disagreement do you want to tell us about?
I have two, if I may indulge
That's fine.
myself. But the second one I'll tell. Well, I already forgot the first one. So the one I'll tell you about is the one that we're kind of in the middle of right now. Actually, we have gotten to the last 2 years of our term, And we have to put together one more biennial budget that is due on like the second week in January. And the last 6 years, we have had federal money and increased revenues, and revenues kept going up and up and up. I think when we came into office, the state budget was like $7.9999 billion. For larger states, I know you're like, that's all, but yes, that's it.
Arkansas is like 6, so.
Yeah, okay. And now we're sitting at around 11 billion. We haven't raised taxes, so that just shows you how there has been so much federal money and revenues have been good. Well, we've been saying, the governor's always said she wants us to live within our means, and for the last 2 years, we've been saying, don't overspend, don't overspend, don't overspend. And we haven't overspent. But together with the legislature, we've spent all the money. And we've told everybody that's coming. We're not in a bad place now, we're just in a leveling off place. And so I am in the middle of, first of all, our cabinet, because our cabinet hasn't been told no in the last 6 years.
Wow.
If anything, they put together their wish list, and she's like, all right, I'll give you 80% of what you want, or whatever. Now we're starting from, there's going to be no new initiatives. And in order to support some of our bigger programs, we're going to have to get it from somewhere else. And we don't know where it's all going to land, but it's been really hard with the cabinet because they still gave us $1.5 billion in asks that they want. You know, and I'm having to bring that 1.5 billion down to zero, you know. And the governor is not in the weeds on this yet. Like, you know, I told her in the car coming up generally what's going on, but I don't think it's time to take it to her until we have something that she can make some decisions on, and we don't yet. So that's one that I'm in process with because the legislature's coming back in January. At least a third of them will be new people that don't even know what a budget is, so they're here with all their ideas to spend money. The rest of them have different understandings of the numbers, and so there's already been a lot of hard conversations that I've had with people where I'm like, I know you're here to ask for something. I'm not trying to negotiate you down to 50%. I'm trying to negotiate you down to 0, you know? And so I think that's going to be really hard for how, and especially if Democrats are all in control together, we're going to have to really think about the future and make some firm decisions. And there's a lot of disagreement that's out there over how we do that. So we'll get back to you next year.
Budgets that make real the proposition that you campaign in poetry, you govern in prose. Budgets are very prose.
You're bringing back memories for me. I was the number 2 person at OMB in the first couple of years of the Obama administration, and you know, by saying no, you protect the principal from having to say no, and it gets exhausting when you have to say no
He's a bad guy.
over and over again.
Oh, I remember the other thing I wanted to say just really quick to bring another point on there was just when we chose our cabinet, I told you I'd never worked in state government. She had, so I remember in the month before she actually assumed office, we sat in this room and just interviewed people for all the cabinet positions. And it became very clear what her measuring stick was, which she's already told you. Competence, experience, diversity of thought, and diversity of where you came from. And so after we chose all those people and put them into their departments, they had 1 year to sort of figure out what was going on before the pandemic hit.
Yeah.
Then the pandemic hit. The decision that she made on the first day of the pandemic was that every member of the cabinet would be part of the COVID response team. I don't know how many other states did that. And we decided that how we were going to manage that is we were going to have a meeting every day with the COVID response team. So the entire cabinet and everybody, I think it was about 40 people in all. It eventually went to Zoom. And we maintained that daily call every day for 3 years. Monday through Friday. We did work on weekends, but we didn't always have a scheduled call. Then we were finally like, oh, well, this is getting to be a lot that we have a daily call with the cabinet. When I tried to pull it away, the cabinet revolted. And they were like, can we please just keep it for at least once a week? And so that's what we've done. And we still do that to this day. Every day at Tuesday at 1 p.m., the entire cabinet gets on for an hour, usually with me leading it. She's there probably 50% of the time.
Listening.
And it's their time to share with one another and for me to give any big update. So I'll say we've only lost 2 cabinet members to retirement. Other than that, they're all still the same. Our staff in our office is largely still the same. And I credit that to the team building that we did because of COVID. And it's now given us the opportunity to now we have really brought down the silos. And so all these commissioners don't see themselves as in competition with their peers. They see, oh, we're working in this together. And it's given such a good opportunity for synergy between the cabinet members. I mean, it's really cool to see the way they work together without us even knowing about it. And I just think that's a real credit to her leadership and how she put together that cabinet, because it really shocked the political muckety-mucks that she didn't hand out any of these jobs to, patronage, basically. And we didn't do that. We have experts in there, and they're doing a really great job.
I have a really geeky follow-up question. I can't envision this. You have 40 officials on your Zoom call every Tuesday.
15 cabinet members
15.
and then staff.
Okay.
policy staff.
And how do you allocate the talk? How do you choose who gets to talk? They're all happy to talk for 10 minutes.
It's evolved a little bit, but usually I do whatever needs to happen at the front for the good of the order at the beginning. This is what the governor's doing. This is what I need to tell you. Here's what you need to
make
do
it
for the
fun.
budget. Well, and I talk about movie recommendations, and I watch this great documentary, or did you see this thing, or what? And during the pandemic, that was an essential time for people to feel human while we're doing this really hard work. And that helped to foster the team aspect of it. But then we have everybody go around, and every single cabinet member gets called on by name. It is absolutely acceptable to say, I don't have anything today. Totally fine. Very few of them ever say that. But sometimes they talk for a minute. Sometimes they talk for 5 or 10 minutes. Sometimes that whole meeting is 20 minutes long. Sometimes it ends up being an hour and 15 minutes long. So, we're flexible with it.
Interesting. Thank you. All right, it's time to open up for audience questions. We have 4 microphones, 1, 2, 3, 4, and I will go from one to the next. And so when you come up to the microphone, please briefly introduce yourself. And it is a convention to remind everybody in this forum that questions end with question marks. There you go. So why don't we start over here?
Fantastic. Thank you, governors and chief of staffs, for a fantastic discussion, but a bit too civil on a conversation about disagreeing, and particularly, I guess, in the climate that we're in. So my question, Dwight Hutchins, mid-career, 96, current dean counsel, is when the other side is being ideological, fundamentalist, and or just their intention is to have a fight and to pick a fight. How do you handle that, and where have you gotten into a situation in which, the other side, they might not be dealing in bad faith, but they definitely aren't looking to compromise?
That's easy to do. That easily happens when you don't talk to people or when you don't listen to people. My first few months in office, workers' comp reform was on the table because the Labor Democrats thought we should take the opportunity to change the workers' comp system. I wasn't all in on that, and the Republicans wanted to tear it apart. And so ultimately, we had some of the Republican leads and some of the Democratic leads come over to the Blaine House for lunch, and we had the workers' comp, couple people from the workers' comp. I explained what happens in workers' comp right now in Maine, and the workers' comp people did that. And a lot of people didn't understand how it worked. It wasn't such a bad system. And once that sunk in, there was no longer this fight. And I said, let's agree on doing a resolve to study the COLAs for long-term, this and that, a resolve to do this and that, and then not change anything dramatically right now. And then we'll agree to leave it alone for a couple of years. And that became the consensus. And we put that in the budget by agreement. And then, there were many other things, but that bill I talked about in 2019, the so-called yellow flag bill, it's a gun bill. It took a long time, hundreds of hours. We had law enforcement at the table, we had the sportsmen at the table, Gun Owners of America at the table, Every Town for Gun Safety. We listened to all of them. We had forensic psychologists at the table, and we developed a bill that got buy-in from almost everybody. If it didn't get buy-in, they at least stood down, didn't oppose it, which was a victory in itself sometimes. You have to define success, right? And that bill went through the Senate, I said, with a unanimous vote in the state Senate, in a divided Senate, and a 136-9 vote, I think, in the House. Amazing. Who does that on a gun bill? And it allows You did?
No, I'm going to jump in here too.
I can go into detail about what it allows, but it was a gun bill. It got enormous support because of buy-in from all the parties.
Well, you're absolutely right. Politics is a tough and tumble sport, and I've got some fire breathers on both sides in Arkansas, and you've got to manage through that. Leadership makes a difference, and what happens is that if you have a governor, if you have a presidential candidate that emboldens the fire breathers, then it's going to get worse. But if you have a governor or a presidential candidate that says, let's calm down, let's see if we can't get some things done, that makes a difference as well. And if you look in Arkansas, there's a lot of difference between your first term and your second term. In the first term, you have a little bit more strength. And so there were some bills that came up that were very divisive. One was a bathroom bill. And I met with the legislators and I say, there's not a problem in Arkansas that this needs to address. Local school districts can handle it. And that solved the problem until the second time it came up. And then they passed the bill. And then they didn't pass that bill, but they passed other types of bills. Some of them I vetoed, some of them got overridden. And so it varies as to how you approach that. But you also have to fight hard. It wasn't on social issues, but I had 5 Republicans that opposed me on just about every issue. Well, I did get out there and primary them and campaign for their primary opponent, and 4 out of 5 of them lost. And so you have to play tough politics, even in a conciliatory world. Whenever in my first term, it was the Religious Freedom Restoration Act that came out. It was seen as too harsh and not fair, and it got to my desk before we had a chance to stop it or anything. This is after Mike Pence had to deal with it in Indiana, and I called a news conference. You had all the national media there, and I said, this bill has come to my desk. I'm sending it back to the legislature for their reconsideration. That is not even constitutional. When it gets to the governor's desk, you either sign it or you veto it. And I said, I'm just sending it back. And of course, I've done that. My first term, I've got a little strength, and it always helps to have 2 nephews in the legislature. They took it, they revised it, and they brought a bill that was acceptable back to me. So a lot of different techniques in governing that you have to use.
Thank you. Let's have another question over here, please.
Nathan Bruschi. Just to pick up on that same topic, Governor, we see a trend that all politics drifts more kind of national. What this does is it, I think, forces a lot of governors into national fights and away from state issues. It also limits how much compromise can be done if all Democrats are all this one thing, all GOP are all this one thing. How do you overcome that? 1, and then 2, how do you create more of a state party flavor where you can really focus your party on certain state issues and not really drift into those national fights?
It's all leadership. And you look, when I ran for governor of Arkansas that I was going to put computer coding in every high school. And people laughed at me and said, you're going to get elected governor with that? We didn't even understand what coding was across Arkansas in some respects. And my daughter is here, and it was her daughter that inspired me to do that. Well, it worked. It was so specific. It was so local. They said, that's exactly what we need in Arkansas. And, of course, it was, a tax cut, and it was restricting the size of government. You fast forward 8 years later with my successor, and you're campaigning on you're going to secure the border. You're going to solve the immigration problem. And so it is the national issues, and you've got to have leaders that can resist that. We've got people running for county commissioner that you'll go knock on doors and they ask, what's your position on the border? Or what's your position on Obamacare? I mean, it's nothing to do locally. So it's the media that drives that national agenda, and you just got to fight for your turf. We're running for governor of Arkansas, and they expect things to get done and accountability. And so sure, you whatever message gets you elected, but when you govern, it's got to be those local issues. But there's a real advantage by campaigning on those local state issues because it gives you the mandate to get things done, and it helped us.
There was a poll came out recently that showed my favorables and Angus King's favorables fairly high, higher than anybody else in the state, which is good. I'll take it. But it said among those who didn't favor me, whatever, weren't sure they liked me. They said they didn't like my position on immigration. I go, I don't have a position on immigration. We have a 600-mile border with Canada. I love Canadians. They can come anytime. But that's the national dialogue that's going on. They just assumed I had a position on immigration.
All right, up top here, please.
Hi, I'm Praveen. I'm a junior at the college and also on the forum committee. Thank you guys all so much for being here today. At the beginning of this forum, we heard about how the left and right seem to be drifting further and further apart from each other. And I'm curious, especially with this election, what gives you guys hope about the future of legislation and the future of our country moving forward?
I'll let you know on November 6th.
So I'll jump in there first. First of all, I'm an optimist by nature. It's a Reagan optimism. But after the Uvalde shooting, Senator Cornyn and Senator Murphy worked together for a bipartisan bill that closed a loophole. Whenever you look at the opportunities after this election, I think we're going to have divided government. And I think there's a really a good opportunity to say we've got to get a border security bill passed and be able to get that done and to address the economic situation. And so I think there's a real opportunity for bipartisanship if the leader of our country will choose that opportunity. And if you want to get things done, because I think it will be divided, and that's the only way. Otherwise, the Americans are just going to see gridlock again. So it all comes down to leadership, and leadership starts with what the American people are expecting. Are you going to hold your elected officials accountable because they're not the furthest on the left or the furthest on the right and the purest? Or are you going to give them some leeway to get things done and to compromise? So it starts with the public, and I hope that we demand that from our leaders next year.
Well, and what gives me hope is what you see on this stage here tonight. And this is so much more common than what the media would have you believe, that there are so many Republicans and Democrats at all levels of government or even within families who are having conversations that don't have to be vitriolic. They don't have to be inflammatory. We can have disagreements and get through them constructively.
Yeah, the temptation to demonize other people is so out there, and I think we've got to keep talking to families, to our kids and grandkids, that how wrong that is, how easy it is to slip into making somebody else the enemy. Because I tell students, look, the person who opposes you today could be your friend tomorrow, an ally tomorrow. Don't burn any bridges. Don't burn any bridges. Don't demonize the other person, the person in the other party or their leadership. It doesn't make sense. It's going to hurt you in the long run.
And I think on the local level, whether it's municipal or state or county or whatever, at least in Maine, we were really lucky to have two parties where there were still enough people in both parties that wanted to work together and wanted to find common ground. And you said it's about leadership, and she put a stake in the ground on day one. I mean, we did not pass bipartisan budgets every time, but in the beginning we did, and that was because she insisted. She said, I want this budget to be passed as an emergency, which means you need 2/3 support of the legislature. And it would have been so easy with Democratic Party control for us to just from the beginning be like, we don't need you, therefore we're going to do what we want to do. But she said, if we do that, this administration is going to be off on the wrong foot from the beginning.
People don't buy in. They won't accept it.
And so Republicans in Maine still feel like when budget season rolls around, they're going to have a voice in it. Whether they get what they want's another story, but they'll have a voice.
Up here on the top, please.
Doria Faruqi. I'm a 2001 Kennedy School alum. I've also served as a chief operating officer for an Atlanta mayor, so kudos to the chiefs of staff up there and the work you do. I wanted to ask a question about how you approach your relationship working with mayors as you think about the economic development and prosperity of your state, particularly also in the context of bipartisanship, red states with very blue cities would love to hear your perspective and how important you think that's going to be going forward in terms of finding common ground.
With the mayors?
Right.
Mayors. Well, our mayors aren't really, they're not partisan political figures for the most part. So we have a pretty good relationship with them.
Well, we have a great relationship with them, but the challenge came first during the pandemic, because we set statewide parameters and tried to have a statewide approach to the pandemic, and the mayors decided to go their own direction in some instances. And so there was some conflict in that. And then you fast forward, take data center operations, and the state passed a law that prevented local municipalities from restricting data centers or for zoning them out. And so there's the conflict of whether you're going to have statewide approach and whether you're going to respect the mayors and the local government in their leadership opportunities and their flexibility. That's the conflict, but by and large, there's a very, very good spirit on economic development that we work on together, and we couldn't get it done without the mayors, and so we had a very good relationship with them.
The only thing I'll add to that, Maine's different. Like, our largest city is 70,000 people. So it's just very different. But what the governor has done that we're getting ready to do in the next budget is she's reinstituting, I think we're calling it the Maine Office of Community Affairs. And it's really a state planning office, but it's pulling together all the things that a municipality needs in order to do the economic development, to build the housing, and sort of the idea is for it to be a one-stop shop to work together with the municipalities on these things. And the Maine Municipal Association is very excited about it right now. So I think it can be hard for municipalities to navigate state government, and so it's really important to think about it from their side of things.
Yeah, we deal with them on property tax issues for the most part, and education funding, but it's a complicated mess. But
Take a question over here, please.
Hi, I'm Eli. I'm an MPP1 here at HCAS, and thank you for the conversation. I know these conversational barriers are significant and important, but I also know there's a lot of institutional barriers. Things like we've talked in your study group, Governor, like gerrymandering or the primary system. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about those institutional barriers and how do you address those institutional barriers?
institutional barriers to bipartisanship?
Agreement, yeah, to bipartisanship.
This would be like the gerrymandering, protecting the congressional districts, making them strong D or strong R, where you're moving away from the middle and you're having candidates go to the extreme to avoid a primary. And but you answered it actually. I mean, we have to have leadership to overcome divide in our country, and that's leaders setting the right example and tone, trying to bring people together and not further dividing America. But then secondly, we need some structural changes to help our leaders. And that could be whether it is more open primary systems, or it could be independent commissions on redistricting to take it out of the political environment to a certain extent, if that is possible at all. And there might be some other solutions, but yeah, the structural changes are really an important part of trying to bring America together. Another one is electoral college. In Maine, I love what Maine does actually. You might hate it, but you know, they're like Nebraska, and you know, you can have electoral...
Other side of the coin from Nebraska, I think.
Split, but that's a kind of electoral reform that might help as well.
Absolutely. And we were under some pressure to call in the legislature and change our electoral system so that it was winner take all, and I said no. It wasn't practical to do it anyway, but because that law was enacted in 1969, at the request of a Republican legislator who thought it was one step in the direction of one person, one vote, basically, or direct voting. So we'd be taking away votes from half the state of Maine, that one electoral college vote. But you're right about institutions. Gerrymandering hasn't been a thing in my state. It obviously has been in a number of other states, and the Supreme Court hasn't really grappled with it appropriately, in my view, but we have a 13-member commission every 10 years with 12 legislators, 6 from each party, and a tie-breaking neutral chair, which makes it real difficult for real gerrymandering to happen from that commission. And if they can't agree, it goes to the Maine Supreme Court. I've argued those cases in the Maine Supreme Court. Not fun. You're not going to like what you get if it goes to the Supreme Court. So I like that kind of apportionment system where there's an independent commission, partisan, including partisanship, but it's independent. It makes a decision that looks at, school districts, municipalities, not divided municipalities, all these objective criteria. I like our system, but other states aren't so lucky. So.
Question over here, please.
Hi, my name is Mark. I'm an MPP here at the Kennedy School, and I'm also a lifelong Mainer, born and raised in the 2nd District, but more recently of the 1st District. So my question, I guess, specifically is about what both the governors, but also both the chiefs see as the role of unified versus divided government in facilitating bipartisanship or agreement. I think, Governor Mills, you noted that both you and Governor Hutchinson have benefited, I believe exclusively, or both of you, from having majorities in both legislative chambers during your time in government. And Jeremy, you noted in particular the partisan budget dynamic, where you started off with the bipartisan budget, but then it became quite controversial when you broke with your own precedent and years of precedent in Maine and moved to the partisan budget. Of course, that's somewhat of a different approach to conflict than what we saw under your predecessor governor, which I would characterize as much more toxic political culture in general under Governor LePage. But it seems to me a different side of the same coin. So I'm curious whether you think that unitary sort of one-party control of state government versus divided government has effects on cooperation, disagreement in state government, and whether one tends to lead to better outcomes.
When we talk about bipartisanship, but we're also talking about, I think we've all said at one point or another, some of our worst disagreements are with people in our own party, leaders or rank and file, people who come into office with great ideals, great goals, but not, in my view, achievable. And so you end up doing battle with people in your own party. So it's not necessarily Republican versus Democrat. And so dealing with those conflicts is just as hard as dealing with Republicans who want this in the budget and Democrats who want that in the budget. It's almost easier to play Monopoly with those issues than it is with some of the other hot button issues where you conflict. I mean, as an example, look, I had a lot of labor support in both of my campaigns. I appreciate labor. I'm a fan of teachers' unions and whatnot. When I got into office, then there was a move for binding arbitration and public employee right to strike. I said, I can't do it. And I vetoed the binding arbitration bill. I said, I can't do it. That was a big Democratic issue. The Republicans didn't want it either, but I said, I can't do that for a lot of reasons. And what I've also done is, and I'm sure a lot of other governors do too, issuing veto letters that are very carefully crafted to recognize both sides or all sides of an issue, but articulate. I mean, I'm a lawyer. I've argued about 100 cases in the Maine Supreme Court. I know that each word makes a difference. Each word counts for something in a law or in a letter. And so we're very careful about drafting veto letters that aren't offensive, but express the views and why I come down on one side or another, or why I suggest a different approach next time. And I think that helps ameliorate the differences in the long run.
That's a real thoughtful question that's hard to answer. But I think that if you have a closely divided legislature between the political parties, it strengthens the executive branch. But if you have a supermajority, it strengthens the legislative branch, and they're able to unite together themselves, and they don't need the governor, for one thing. So that's the answer. Of course, I'm a Republican. I want Republicans to win, but I think that's the reality of it. Now, in Arkansas, you talk about structural changes. There's two problems in Arkansas for the strength of the governor. One is that a veto can be overridden by a simple majority of the legislature. So people ask me, well, why did you sign this bill? Well, I get tired of being overridden. And I say that jokingly. I only vetoed 4 bills, and 3 of them were sustained. And so they respect, as you said, Janet, that if you write a good veto letter, sometimes that can be helpful, and they respect the role of the governor. And then the other one is it requires a 75%, or excuse me, a 3/4 vote to pass an appropriation bill. 3/4 vote. And so we passed Medicaid expansion in Arkansas, and that's easy on the authorization side, but when you want to appropriate the money, I got to get 75% of the vote in a supermajority Republican area. So that's another story, but those are structural changes I'd like to see made in Arkansas.
All right, last question.
Sorry. Hi, I'm Lucinda. Thank you so much for coming, governors and chiefs. And as a former chief of staff in Australia, I really value having the chiefs up on stage.
And you're still standing. Congratulations.
So I guess you just touched on it a little bit, which was about how there's, like, I think, an increasing division within parties. Do you see that? I'm interested to know where you see that going, if there will be any longer-term consequences as part of that. And then the second question, if I'm allowed to the chiefs, very quickly, would you consider running for public office? And if not, why not?
That's a short answer, no. Jeremy, do you think about running for office?
My husband is a legislator, which is a whole nother story. But, so yes, I've often been like, oh, because I get to see him do it. But I think after having this job, and I don't think I would, no.
It's not very well paid.
At one time I
either.
thought about it, but no, not now.
It's not very well paid in Maine. Legislature's part-time, seasonal, and I would discourage it.
But you have your first question.
Oh.
Which was the divide?
Yeah, divide within the parties. Do you think there's going to be any long-term or really significant consequences of that, or is that just sort of a passing?
Well, it's already been 200 years we've had party division in America. No, I mean, that's the 2 major parties. I think, you know, it's just so hard for a third party to rise in a 2-party system that we have been the hallmark of our democracy. And so, and then you're going to have very tough political races and division. And here again, we've always had division in America. You know, the civil rights era. I mean, Abraham Lincoln was called the original guerrilla. The only problem is they didn't have the internet back then, so it only got a little bit of coverage, perhaps. Edwin Stanton called him that, who later became a part of his cabinet. And so they've had division. The difference is that leaders, particularly once they get elected, try to overcome the division. And that's what we need today. And today we're feeding off of division in America. We've got to break that addiction.
I think that's a good.
Yeah, I mean, read the Federalist Papers. It talks about not parties per se, but factions. How are factions going to help form the American government over time? But I think there's hope. I do. Yeah.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking our panelists for a very insightful discussion.